On 6 July 1945. In the heavy summer air of Washington. The war was over, yet the anger lingered. In a quiet office near the Pentagon, General George C. Marshall paused over a personnel file. His jaw tight, his memory sharper than the celebrations outside. The name inside was Lloyd Fredendall, a commander many soldiers blamed for disaster. A man who had failed in battle, yet risen in rank. This was the shadow behind Patton's legend. The uncomfortable truth that before brilliance arrived, failure had been rewarded. 2 years earlier at Kasserine Pass. In the dust of Tunisia, American units broke and ran, paying in blood for confused orders. Fredendall commanded from distant bunkers, radios crackling with uncertainty. Officers fuming at his absence, men dying at the front. When Eisenhower removed him in February 1943, the decision felt just to the troops, and Patton's arrival felt like justice. Yet the Army is an institution of careers, not only courage, shaped by politics. And Washington had other plans for Fredendall. Behind closed doors, senior generals weighed loyalty against accountability. Fearing precedent, protecting their own. Promotions followed reassignment. Stars were pinned in safer postings. And whispers of scandal spread through the ranks. For soldiers who fought in Tunisia, this felt like betrayal. A wound reopened, a lesson unlearned. Patton's fury would later dominate headlines. But this story begins earlier, with a promotion that stunned the Army. As Marshall closed the file that July morning, the question hung heavy: what kind of army had the war created? The answer would ripple through commands and reputations, shaping Patton's rise and haunting the men who watched. It is here, in that unresolved tension, after victory was declared, that the scandal truly begins. On 14 February 1943, as cold rain swept the hills of Tunisia, Eisenhower made a decision that would echo for years. Inside an Allied headquarters near Tebessa, he removed Fredendall quietly, without ceremony, without public condemnation. The Army needed momentum, morale, and above all confidence, and George S. Patton was summoned like a weapon unsheathed. To the men at the front, this felt like rescue, but to Washington, it looked dangerously like admission of failure. Fredendall did not return in disgrace. Instead, he was sent home gently, shielded by rank, protected by silence. In the corridors of the War Department, careers were considered fragile instruments, not easily broken by one bad command. Marshall and his staff feared headlines, feared congressional anger, feared a precedent where defeat destroyed senior officers. The Army was expanding at historic speed, and experienced generals, even flawed ones, were still seen as assets. By May 1943, Fredendall received a new assignment. Administrative, distant from gunfire, and carefully respectable. Among combat officers, resentment hardened, whispered in mess tents, shared over cigarettes, sharpened by memory. They had buried friends at Kasserine, watched units collapse, and now saw responsibility dissolve into promotion. This was not cowardice in battle, they said, but cowardice in accountability, and it cut deeper. Patton, meanwhile, enforced discipline with fury, slapping order into chaos, demanding pride where fear once ruled. His success rewrote the narrative, allowing the Army to move forward without reopening wounds. Yet beneath Patton's victories lay an unresolved bargain. Success purchased by forgetting who had failed. The promotion that followed Fredendall would soon ignite outrage, not among civilians, but within the officer corps itself. As rumors reached senior commanders in late 1943, anger simmered beneath official smiles. The Army had won battles, but inside its own ranks, trust was quietly eroding. By 9 December 1943, the war in Europe raged on. But another battle was unfolding quietly, inside the American Army. At an officers' gathering in London, resentment surfaced openly, voiced in careful tones, sharpened by months of restraint. Junior commanders compared notes, recalling Tunisia, recalling orders that never came, recalling men lost for nothing. Fredendall's name moved through the room like smoke. Unspoken at first, then impossible to ignore. Reports reached Eisenhower's desk from Sicily and Italy. Not of defeat, but of bitterness. Combat leaders felt a line had been crossed. Where failure no longer carried consequence. Where stars shielded mistakes. The promotion system, they argued, rewarded obedience to hierarchy, not responsibility to soldiers. For an army still fighting for legitimacy. This was dangerous, corrosive, and deeply personal. In Washington, during January 1944, Marshall listened as staff officers debated behind closed doors. Some defended the decision, citing manpower shortages, institutional stability, and political realities back home. Others warned that morale was fragile. That trust once broken could not be ordered back into place. The scandal was not public yet, but inside the army, it was already real. Patton, commanding in Italy, heard the rumors through trusted aides, and his anger burned white-hot. He believed in punishment as much as praise, in fear as much as inspiration, in consequences above all else. To him, Fredendall's advancement was not a mistake. It was a lie, and lies poisoned armies. Yet Patton also understood the rules, and he stayed silent, storing rage for battles he could fight. By March 1944, the issue could no longer be contained within whispers. Letters circulated unofficially, opinions hardened, and reputations began to fracture under scrutiny. What had once been a quiet reassignment now looked like an insult to every man who had bled in North Africa. The army had avoided public scandal, but internally, it stood on the edge of something far worse. On 2 April 1944, as preparations for Normandy consumed every waking hour, the controversy reached a breaking point. Inside Allied headquarters in England, officers argued in hushed rooms, aware that unity was as vital as ammunition. The army could not afford division before the greatest invasion in history. Yet resentment refused to stay buried. Fredendall's promotion was now more than a decision. It was a symbol of what the army would tolerate. Marshall faced a grim calculus in Washington, balancing justice against survival, morale against momentum. He knew public exposure would invite congressional fury, media scrutiny, and doubt at the worst possible moment. The invasion demanded confidence, not introspection, and certainly not a purge of senior leadership. So the army chose silence, tightening control, discouraging discussion, and moving the war forward. In combat units, this restraint felt like censorship, deepening the wound. Officers whispered that loyalty flowed upward, never downward, protecting careers, not lives. The men who trained for Normandy carried these doubts quietly, loading rifles, memorizing beaches, trusting each other instead of the system. It was an unspoken fracture line, invisible from above, but real on the ground. Patton, sidelined in England as part of a deception plan, fumed in isolation. To him, the Fredendall affair confirmed everything he despised about peacetime. Generals playing wartime roles. He believed war stripped men to truth, revealing strength and weakness without mercy. Yet here was mercy for failure, and discipline for success. An inversion Patton never forgot. By 5 June 1944, the scandal was officially buried beneath invasion orders. Normandy demanded sacrifice, and history would remember beaches, not promotions. But among those who survived, memory endured, shaping how they judged commanders and trusted authority. The army crossed the Channel united in appearance, divided in conscience. As the war surged forward after D-Day, the question returned quietly, unresolved, waiting for peace. When victory finally came, those buried decisions would rise again, demanding explanation. On 8 May 1945, as church bells rang across Europe, victory arrived with relief, not clarity. In the offices of the War Department, celebration mixed with unfinished business. Files reopened, memories sharpened by peace. Men who had stayed silent during battle now felt free to speak, their restraint no longer required by necessity. The Fredendall decision, once buried under Normandy, resurfaced with uncomfortable force. Letters from officers began circulating again. This time with dates, names, and consequences clearly stated. They described Tunisia in painful detail. Distant headquarters, broken units, and orders divorced from reality. These were not acts of revenge, but attempts at truth, shaped by loss and responsibility. The army, victorious yet vulnerable, faced itself for the first time. Marshall understood the danger of post-war scrutiny, especially from Congress and the press. America wanted heroes, clean victories, and simple narratives, not internal failures. Yet ignoring the issue threatened the institution's future, risking cynicism among the next generation of officers. Accountability, delayed, was still accountability, but only if handled carefully. Fredendall, now far from the spotlight, sensed the shift. His career had survived war, but peace was a harsher judge. Less forgiving, more inquisitive. Whispers followed him through corridors, no longer restrained by operational necessity. Promotion had protected him in war, but it isolated him afterward. Patton, touring Europe in June 1945, spoke openly with trusted commanders. He did not name names publicly, but his meaning was unmistakable. Responsibility mattered more than rank. To Patton, victory without honesty was hollow, and peace demanded reckoning. His words spread quietly, reinforcing what many already believed. By early July 1945, the army stood at a crossroads. It could defend its decisions forever, or learn from them honestly. The scandal had never exploded, yet its damage was real, shaping trust, doctrine, and leadership. What followed would define how the post-war army remembered failure. On 6 July 1945, in the stifling heat of Washington, senior officers gathered to decide what lessons would survive the war. Victory parades rolled outside. Yet inside conference rooms, the mood was restrained, serious, and quietly defensive. The army was shrinking rapidly. Wartime protections fading. Reputations suddenly exposed to peacetime judgment. What had been tolerated in war could no longer be ignored in peace. Marshall pressed for reform without spectacle, determined to protect the institution, not individual careers. He believed the army must learn silently, rewriting doctrine, reshaping command culture, avoiding public humiliation. The Fredendall affair became a case study without a name. Discussed indirectly, referenced carefully. Failure, the lesson said, must be identified early, corrected fast, and never hidden behind rank. New evaluation systems emerged, emphasizing frontline presence, adaptability, and accountability under pressure. Staff officers were warned that distance from combat bred blindness, and blindness killed. Promotion boards quietly adjusted priorities, valuing battlefield credibility over political reliability. The scandal had no headline, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Among younger officers, the message was clear and deeply personal. They had watched the system protect one of its own, and vowed not to repeat it. Trust would be earned downward, not enforced upward, through shared risk and visible leadership. This was the army Patton believed in, even if he never saw its full arrival. Fredendall retired without ceremony. His name absent from official histories, present only in memory. There was no trial, no public reckoning. Just quiet disappearance from the narrative of victory. For some, this felt like injustice unfinished, for others, unnecessary mercy. The army chose continuity over confession, stability over spectacle. As the post-war world took shape, this buried scandal influenced every command decision that followed. It taught leaders what silence cost, and what accountability preserved. The war had ended, but its hardest lessons arrived afterward. On 18 September 1945, as uniforms slowly disappeared from city streets, the army faced a quieter battlefield. Demobilization stripped away urgency, leaving behind memory, reputation, and unresolved judgment. Officers returning to civilian life carried stories they could not publish, but never forgot. Among them, The Fredendall affair remained a warning past in private conversations. In military schools reopening that autumn, instructors spoke carefully about North Africa. They described command failure without names, emphasizing distance from troops, poor communication, rigid thinking. Students understood the subtext immediately, history speaking between the lines. This was accountability without accusation, education shaped by omission. Patton, restless in occupied Germany, sensed the cost of this silence. He believed armies learned best through brutal honesty, not quiet revision. To him, shielding failure weakened future commanders, inviting repetition under new names. His frustration grew, even as his influence quietly spread. By November 1945, internal studies circulated within the army. Restricted, unsensational, deeply critical. They analyzed Kasserine with precision, identifying leadership breakdown as the decisive factor. Fredendall's command style was dissected without attribution. His mistakes turned into doctrine. The scandal had become institutional memory, stripped of personality. Among veterans, however, names mattered. Those who had fought remembered who had led, who had hidden, who had risen anyway. Trust in senior leadership recovered slowly. Rebuilt through Korea, through new wars, through different tests. The damage was not fatal, but it was lasting. As America entered the Cold War, the Army presented a unified front. Behind it stood lessons learned the hard way, paid for in blood and bitterness. The promotion that once outraged the ranks now served as a silent boundary. A line not to cross again. Failure would still occur, but it would no longer be invisible. By the end of that year, the scandal had faded from public memory. Inside the Army, it never truly disappeared, shaping leadership long after the war ended. On 20 June 1950, as news from Korea reached Washington, old lessons suddenly felt urgent again. The Army, now smaller but seasoned by memory, faced war without the luxury of improvisation. Commanders studied past failures quietly, knowing the cost of repeating them would be paid immediately. Kasserine, though never named aloud, hovered over every decision. In the early weeks of Korea, frontline leadership was scrutinized harder than ever before. Generals were expected forward, visible, exposed to the same danger as their men. Distance from combat, once tolerated, was now viewed as liability, not prudence. The Fredendall shadow shaped this shift, even if few civilians understood why. Promotion boards remembered the scandal, refining standards with ruthless clarity. Officers who avoided responsibility found careers stalled, reputations quietly cooling. Those who adapted under fire rose quickly, trusted because they had been tested. The Army had learned that competence could not be assumed, it had to be proven. By 15 September 1950, during the Incheon landing, confidence in leadership mattered as much as strategy. MacArthur dominated headlines, but beneath him, commanders were evaluated relentlessly. Failure was corrected fast, sometimes brutally, before it could metastasize. Silence, once the Army's shield, was now its enemy. Patton did not live to see this transformation, but his influence was unmistakable. His insistence on accountability echoed in doctrine, training, and command culture. The idea that rank alone deserved protection had died quietly, without ceremony. In its place stood expectation, harsh and necessary. Across later conflicts, from Vietnam to the Gulf, echoes of the old scandal remained. Investigations followed defeats more openly. Careers ended faster, excuses carried less weight. The Army still made mistakes, but it no longer hid them reflexively. This was the real legacy of that forgotten promotion. What began as outrage over one man's advancement became a boundary for generations. The cost of learning had been high, but forgetting would have been higher. History rarely announces its lessons, it whispers them through consequence. On 4 January 1962, as the Army prepared a new generation for modern war, the past still lingered. Young officers studied leadership under pressure, unaware that many rules were written in silence. Behind every doctrine lesson stood memory, shaped by failures no one publicly claimed. The Fredendall affair had become part of the Army's unseen architecture. In classrooms at Fort Leavenworth, Instructors emphasized presence, decisiveness, and moral courage. They warned that command was not safety, but exposure, not privilege, but burden. These principles were taught as timeless truths, yet they were born from specific wounds. History had been absorbed, then hidden, within professionalism. Veterans of North Africa, now senior mentors, spoke cautiously in private. They did not seek revenge, only assurance that loss had meant something. For them, the scandal was never about one man, but about what the army chose to protect. Their quiet influence ensured the lesson endured. By the early 1960s, public memory had erased the controversy entirely. Books praised victories, celebrated Patton, and simplified the path to success. Failure was edited out, leaving clean narratives for comfortable audiences. Inside the army, however, memory resisted erasure. This tension shaped responses to future disasters. From early Vietnam setbacks to Cold War crises, leaders felt pressure not only to win, but to explain, to justify, to own outcomes. The cost of concealment had been learned once, and it would not be forgotten easily. Accountability became survival, not virtue. Fredendall's name faded from records. Absent from monuments, present only in footnotes. The promotion that once outraged soldiers no longer shocked anyone. Because the system had changed. What had been scandal became structure, outrage transformed into expectation. This was how institutions truly evolve. As decades passed, the army grew more transparent, though never perfectly honest. Each reform traced back, in part, to a single uncomfortable decision during war. The past does not vanish, it rearranges the future. On 6 July 1975, 30 years after victory, the army looked back with colder eyes. Vietnam had ended painfully, forcing institutions to confront failure publicly, not quietly. What once had been buried in World War memory now felt painfully familiar. The old lesson returned, sharper, harder, and impossible to ignore. Senior leaders acknowledged, privately and sometimes publicly, that silence had costs. Protecting careers had never protected soldiers, it only delayed reckoning. The Fredendall promotion, once defended as necessity, stood as early warning ignored. History had been patient, but it collected interest. In revised doctrine, accountability became explicit, written, unavoidable. Commanders were removed faster. Investigations launched sooner, excuses accepted less. This was not cruelty, but survival, learned through repetition and loss. The army no longer pretended that rank erased consequence. Patton's shadow loomed large in this final understanding. His rage, once inconvenient, now seemed prophetic. He had demanded responsibility in war, long before institutions were ready to hear it. Time, not argument, had proven him right. Fredendall himself remained a footnote, not a villain, not a martyr. His story mattered only because the system around him failed first. The outrage was never about promotion alone, but about trust. When trust breaks, armies bleed. For viewers today, this story offers a quiet warning. Victory can hide mistakes, success can excuse failure. Silence can feel efficient. But institutions endure only when they confront uncomfortable truth. That is the real scandal, and the real lesson. The war ended in parades, but its meaning arrived decades later. Not in medals or speeches, but in changed behavior, and remembered consequence. History does not punish instantly, it waits.